name's Jacob Yerrick. I'm a scientist at the Environmental Defense Fund, and today I'm going to be talking about pathways for climate resilience in marine fisheries. As it's a Friday, I figured we should start with a bit more of a story. I work in Kiribati. I've worked there for about the last 5 or 6 years. It's a Pacific island nation of about 120,000 people. This island is Butaritari, where about 3% of the population live. I was able to spend about a month here learning from the local community. Our research group has been focusing on climate change, coral reef fisheries, and the impact that that has on human health, food security, and nutrition. Unfortunately, if you go about 300 kilometers south of Butaritari, this is the island of South Tarawa with about 60% of the population, where a lot of the fisheries that we're monitoring in the outer remote reefs are in quite a dramatic decline. So I was really lucky to take this case study to this awesome working group that some of us have maybe heard a little bit about this week. I've bolded those that are here at the conference. The SNAP Climate Resilient Fisheries Working Group started in about 2020 and has been working pretty much iteratively that whole time. We first started with this main question: what key attributes support fisheries resilience to climate change impacts, and how can these attributes be recognized and enhanced in marine fishery systems? So step one, which was co-led by my colleague Julia Mason at EDF, Jackie Lau at James Cook University, and myself in Fish and Fisheries last year, is all about just defining these resilience attributes. We looked at it across 3 different dimensions: the ecological dimension, socio-economic, and governance dimension. Through an iterative review process and a kind of a collaborative working group, we came up with 38 attributes. And we tried to place them in this resilience domain adaptive capacity that we've seen a few times from Josh Sinner's work. So within the 38 attributes in the paper, we just first had to define what resilience was and define all these attributes, which is a little harder than we originally expected. We described how they actually apply in fishery systems and also looked at how they can confer or limit resilience in these systems. We provide some examples as well. But this was just step 1. So step 2 was to build a tool that used these resilience attributes to assess climate resilience in other places. So this tool, the Climate Resilient Fisheries Planning Tool, just launched in January, which we're really excited about. It's meant for fisheries managers, stakeholders, right holders, local communities, scientists, basically you name it. But first we had to actually refine it after we built it. So we started off with these 18 case studies that I'm about to get into, and the 38 attributes that made the entire full process. This tool now is distilled down to 22, to give you an example. And today we're just going to be focusing on one metric of how we kind of think about attributes called the score or strength of an attribute relative to that system. But there's a bunch of different things in the papers that I'm about to present that we're not going to get into today, things like importance and other factors. So jumping in, here's our 18 case studies. We tried our best to kind of span the geographies, but we were obviously limited with our working group members. This is a paper that's in review right now in Fish and Fisheries with my awesome collaborators, Whitney Friedman from Santa Cruz, Kristen Kleisner also from UC Santa Barbara, and an awesome PhD student, Lily, from UC Santa Barbara. So jumping in, here are 30 resilience attributes again, and the 3 dimensions, and these icons will show up a little bit later as well. We're presenting score as kind of our data variable. And as you can see, they're ordered by levels of increasing score. So we're calling the top 3 to 5 attributes within each dimension robust sources of resilience because they all appeared very strong across all of our case studies. You can hone in on the ecological dimension, looking at ecosystem connectivity and larval dispersal, which is obviously directly tied to spatial management. We found that and pulled that out through some of our case studies. But I also want to focus on some of those that dropped a little bit lower. So adult mobility and a target species and fisher mobility are still really important, but they're case dependent. So yes, they could be on average lower, but still in some fisheries, they're very, very important. Similarly, we highlighted attributes that critically need more attention. Things like social and economic diversity, equitable and inclusive governance were on average really low. However, in the paper we described that these actually ranked highest in importance. So these are the things where we can put future energy and future research. So flipping the axis a little bit, now the resilience attributes are going to be on the bottom, and we're going to look at how the case studies kind of panned out within this system. So we used a hierarchical cluster analysis to pull together 5 different groups or fishery archetypes as we're describing them. And our goal here was to find common lesson that kind of breaks the bounds of most systems and how we think about fisheries. And what I mean by that is there might be a fin fish associated with a invertebrate fishery, or a single species focused with a multi-species. And so when you see that, I want you to think, oh, that's awesome. These are lessons that we can kind of take from different systems that you might not think about. So I'll run through these kind of fast. The first group is the easiest. I figured start with the easy one. Was kind of enabled by all dimensions. That meant that there were moderate to high scores in each one of the 3 dimensions. But specifically, one of the reasons why these fisheries clustered together was because of high participation and accountability within the governance sector. Group 4 pulled out within the cluster analysis because the stocks were a little bit more variable than the first group. There's still really strong social processes here and good governance, particularly place attachment, which is sense of place attached to that location. Social capital and learning capacity were really high. However, here for our 2 Japan fisheries and the Juan Fernandez Island fishery, there was a little bit less mobility and movement between fisheries for fishers, as well as social diversity and economic diversity. The third group and the last one before our major kind of cluster 5, 4, and 3 have higher governance than clusters 2 and 1. Had moderate scores for the ecological and governance attributes, but still ecosystem connectivity and larval dispersal, those things tied to spatial management, ranked really high. Getting into my bread and butter, the small-scale fisheries. You see PNG, Fiji, Madagascar, and our Kiribati giant clam fishery. These small-scale coral reef clusters, we found really strong ecological and social processes despite potentially lower economic wealth and resources and infrastructure. And so here, one of the things that we pulled out was high place attachment and social capital. So including that, there were pretty low scores for economic opportunity and mobility. When you think of a coral reef fishery, fishers, on these island atolls are kind of stuck where they're fishing. But there's good ecological things going on because the habitats are quite diverse. So also species diversity with multi-species fisheries is quite good. The last group is group 1, ecologically strong and governance constrained. So this had the lowest governance scores, but we want to focus this doesn't necessarily mean bad governance. It means a lack of coordination between levels of governance. So here we had all of the case studies were kind of constrained by management strategies and the regulatory system, but we found good learning capacity, good knowledge diversity, and pretty good social diversity across all of these. So what do we do with this heat map? We wanted to use, like I said, these 5 fishery clusters to sort of start the process. So as more fisheries are coming in using this tool and filling out some of these attributes, we can sort of start to cluster new fisheries or users that are bringing in new data to fishery clusters that already exist. But what's the next step? So we talked about 2 pathways of resilience in this paper, loosely associated with these large cluster breaks. The first is resilience through economic assets and effective governance. So here that includes the high capacity fisheries, industrial fisheries, commercial, and also market-orientated cash-based economy fisheries. So when you have that, there's a reinforcing feedback loop where more wealth and reserves leads to access to knowledge, and that promotes technology in your fishery. With that, turned wealth into more assets and more economic opportunity, and that drives governance, responsiveness, and innovation further. So in the paper, we sort of dive into different actionable levers that we can take within that feedback loop to build resilience in your system, depending on which part of the dimension or which attributes your fishery might be lacking. Similarly, pathway 2, more of the kind of smaller scale fishery group, was resilience through ecological assets and strong communities. So here it was really about ecological assets, the fish stocks and what you're getting from your resources, not being turned into cash as rapidly in the system, but there's still intrinsic capacities, just generically your species are maybe more resilient or the healthy ecosystems are a bit more intact. This can lead to economic diversity and more investments in infrastructure, but one of the major things we took home from this pathway is increasing that place attachment and resilience mindset within the local community, building social capital through things like fishery cooperatives or bringing fishers together, sharing knowledge really helped So again, in the paper, we sort of dive into some of these levers and action points to build resilience in other pathways and other systems. So as I mentioned, Kiribati settled within that pathway 2, that coral reef small-scale fishery group. Here, and across all of the remote islands in Kiribati, we just have an incredible amount of place attachment. Everybody is really excited to learn, so our learning capacity is really high, and there's social agency. You can go into a community and want to talk about fisheries management. Everybody gets really excited, stops what they're doing, and just gets really excited. All of those different socio-economic attributes, as we're calling them, lead to more collective and adaptive governance. So what we saw was community-based fisheries management where local knowledge is being incorporated was actually much more effective on the outer islands than the South Tarawa Island. You remember the one with all the houses that's much more developed, because there, those village-level boundaries have sort of declined, and people have lost their attachment to their specific reefs. So I will add that within the Climate Resilient Fisheries Planning Tool, this is obviously a very data-limited fishery. What we did with our team was we went back and did a participatory workshop. So in our toolkit, we have facilitator guides, some videos, a little bit more information to help you sort of run a workshop if your fishery is data-limited. This included our fisheries officers on the left, who are actually monitoring giant clams in the field right now, fishers on the right, which is really fun to work with. The supply chain actors, which is on the left. Originally, we kind of missed this in our social survey data, but within the participatory workshop, we learned that giant clam are actually critically important for food security. These species are salted, and when motors break down or weather challenges reef-based fisheries, these invertebrate fisheries are really what's going through. Additionally, the fisheries managers that we worked with were at the island scale and also the national level. And all 4 of those colleagues are co-authors on this paper, and just want to point out that I'm using my voice here today to share their voice. So in conclusion, just a couple take-home messages since I know it's getting late in the conference. We just want to really stress that resilience is about the natural system, of course, but also the human system. It's not just resilient of what to what, but resilience for whom. Again, this tool is ready. We're so excited. So if anybody's interested, please come and grab any of us. Linked here is like a little way to connect on email where I can share some of the papers. You can get the websites and that sort of thing. The Fish and Fisheries paper, where we kind of discuss some of the attributes and how the pathways are settled out with the case studies, is just a starting point. 18 fisheries isn't covering the whole globe. So we're really keen to learn from all of you. And I just want to stress, we've heard knowledge co-production and participatory workshops a lot. It's a really good way to engage with communities where there's not as much data. Last but not least, this is just the starting point. We're really excited that this has morphed into a Ocean Decade program called FishCore, led by Kathy Mills and Kristen Kleisner, which both are here. This is kind of a networking group that could be using this tool, but also we're really excited to learn from everybody. So with that, thank you so much for your time. And I'd like to thank just hundreds of collaborators and working group members and everyone that I've been working with in Kiribati to get this where we are. So thank you.